Hi everyone. I thought recording a video about how to browse the FHIR specification website would be useful. Trying to do this during a meeting is a little bit overwhelming. It goes too fast and you can't go back and look again. So I'm going to do this as detailed as possible for a example or two, a resource or two. And the video recording will help you pause it to follow or repeat as needed. I don't have a script, so this is just a kind of a messy video. And it's actually a first video I'm posting to a YouTube channel that I'm creating named Playing with Fire. That's where you're seeing this video. Okay, so this is the hl7.org/FHIR website. It is usually it's the latest release version of FHIR. Up here you could see there's a link to directory of published versions, and there's a list of versions here. The one that says current, if you open it, it will take you to a site. This is for the release 5 that's coming up. It's a preview, it's a build, so this is at the build.fhir.org. It's the latest published development version of the specification. It looks the same, but there's a clear hint that this is not the official released version. Okay, so if we go back to the home page for the specification, I'm going to try to walk through reading the documentation for a lab request, because that's, I think, useful for a project I'm in. So from here, you have several tabs and there's a lot of content here. I'm just going to jump to that one resource and just focus on that. I could make other videos for the other content later. So there is a search here that you could use to find things in the specification. You want to search a specific version, so you could click on that and then search within this version for what you need in the specification, if you know what you want. That might help you find it faster. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the tab of resources, which lists all the FHIR resources. Okay, let me close this. So there is a section here that's considered the clinical section. And if you want to see how lab request is done, you would go to the ServiceRequest resource right here. So we're going to click on that. And now you are at the ServiceRequest URL for this resource. It's called ServiceRequest. Okay. This is the home page for this resource. It has the content, and it's text and a table, and we'll walk through this. But there are additional tabs. There are examples of instances of a service request, and if you click on it, you will see an example. There are different formats. We'll walk through that. There is a detailed description of the fields in the resource request. So there is that is the service request resource dot and the field name, and we'll get to this also. I'd ignore the mappings for now, and if this resource has profiles and extensions published as part of the specifications, you would find them here. These are part of the specifications, of the FHIR specification. So there is one profile on service request. It's a profile for genetic purposes. And then there are a few extensions that you could use when you create an instance of a service request. I might get into these. Let's see how long this video is going to be. Okay, so when you're at a service request, a few things to notice. So you have the working group who is sort of developing this. Maturity level means how mature this resource is in the FHIR specification. And there are maturity levels there, and you could read them here. Okay, just to be aware that when you're looking at a resource, the maturity level, if it's still very new, it means this resource will likely evolve, and your use cases will likely be considered by the working group. A resource that is very set and stable will have a normative status or a very high maturity, and it's less likely that will change. Okay, and this is for a trial use. This resource is developed still in a trial use, and you could follow that to see more. Okay, so you'd want to read this text. Don't jump to the table here, because a lot of things that you would not understand by looking at the fields and their meaning and so forth are captured in the narrative description. So a service request is a request that's done usually during a clinical encounter by a provider to some service provider to perform some kind of service. And there are giving examples here. Okay, one of the examples would be a lab test. So you have like diagnostic tests and studies are up here, but there are lots of other service requests. Okay, the boundaries and relationship section exists in almost all of the resource homepages, and it tries to help you understand what is a service request versus some of the other FHIR resources. So there is some sense of what a service request that overlaps with what a task is, what a procedure is, an observation, so forth. So you want to understand the boundaries and how they relate to each other, these various things. And it's important to try to understand that. And then, before the table that you'll see here, in most of these resources, you'll see this last paragraph that tries to give you a hint of which other resources have a reference to a service request. So it helps you navigate from one resource to another related resource. So an encounter, for example, references one or more service requests. And if you jump to encounter, you'll see the field that points to service request. Okay, so now this table is really the central place that you want to clearly understand what this means, because there are a lot of useful links in here. Okay. So the first thing is this is a service request resource. Think of this as a class name. It's a type. The parent type for service request is domain resource. All FHIR resources are subtypes of domain resource. It's a flat list of subclasses of domain resource. If you click here, you will jump to the parent type for service request. And eventually it helps to understand what's up here. But this documentation page also shows you what is inherited. So this right here tells you the inherited fields that are coming from domain resource and any other parent. And they are in order. So ID comes from the top parent and so forth, and then extensions comes from domain resource. Because domain resource, if I click on it, you'll see it also has a parent. Domain resource is a resource. If you click on the resource, you'll go to the resource page and you'll see resource has no parent. So this is the top type in the hierarchy. Okay, let's go back to service request. So this first row is about the type of the resource, and almost all resources will have a similar row. They all inherit from domain resource. They all inherit the same fields. Okay. Now the next thing you see is a list of fields for this resource. Let's ignore the flags for now, and let's just focus that fields have a cardinality. So this is 0 to many. For example, a service request can have a reference, okay, to a care plan or another service request or another medication request, and it's basically saying that this request is based on that other request, and you have 0 to many references. And then you have a brief textual description of what that field means, but there is usually a lengthier description, and the way you get to the lengthier description is you click on the field name. So let's find something that's a little bit more okay, so for example, this field, what is being requested and ordered? This is the code field. You would put a code, and it's only 0 to 1, so you'd put one code to represent what is being requested. So if you click on the field name, it will take you to the more detailed description of that field, which exists in the detailed description tab right up here. So if you go here, you'll see all the detailed descriptions for all the fields, but if you click on the code, you'll just jump to that specific entry on that tab. So I click on code here. It jumped to the detailed section, and it's at the code, and you could read more because some of these have more description that will not show up in that summary table. Okay, so I'm going to go through these links, but I'm going to do that from the main table here. Okay, so we were looking at the code. It has 0 to 1 values. The value that it holds is what's called a codable concept. Okay, and this is a data type. Okay, it's not a reference to another resource. The way you could easily tell if it's a reference or not, references start with the word reference and parentheses and the possible reference types that you could point to. So a reference points to another object. A codable concept is just a data type that you populate to fill in this field. Data types are not always simple. They could be complex, and we'll look through that. So if I click on this, it will take me to the explanation of what codable concept is, and I will do that in a minute. But if we keep reading, you have let me go to code. I was on code right here. So in this textual description, there is usually also another link. This link right here is to a page that describes the allowed values that can be put in the instance of a codable concept. Okay, and this will make more sense as we look at these details. But this is basically the value set, the vocabulary, the set of values that are allowed in a field. And then after that, you'll see a word usually here. So see, you have required here. You have example here. This means that this value set on this page, if I go to it, the values that you see there are just meant as an example of the kinds of things that would go into a code field. They're not required, but the required ones mean that if you use this field, and this field you have to use it because it's a one-to-one, you'll have to pick a value from the request intent. Okay, so just to show you what is an example of a required value, I'm going to click on that, and you will come down here and you'll see the set of values right here. These are the values that are required. You pick one of these. Okay, and there is a hierarchy kind of represented here. And you could read about what these values mean, and you're supposed to use the value according to its meaning. And if you have a value, if you need to populate that field with some value that means something that is not in this table, you're sort of stuck because it's a required set, which means you cannot pick another value from outside that set. The code field, because it's a very general field, they just want to give you an example, and this example is procedure codes that's coming from SNOMED CT. So if I click on that, it will take you to a page that represents the value set, okay, for procedure code. So this is procedure code, and it's a value set. Okay, this is an identifier. This URL is the identifier of this value set. So this whole URL. Okay. And there is some metadata here. I'm not going to get into vocabulary stuff today too much, but you could see here, these are all examples of service request codes, procedure codes that are used in a service request to request this procedure. But they're only examples. Okay. So again, that was clicking on the vocabulary entry right here. Let's look at the codable concept idea, okay? And maybe it would be easier to first let's look at a code, and then we'll look at a codable concept, because code is a simple value, it's a string, and it's one of these strings. So here, for example, in this priority field in the documentation, they simply enumerated the 4 values, and they understand that the reader would understand what this field means. Okay, so let's see if we go to priority. You'll see there's some text here that you did not see on that table. Okay, the table showed you all those 4 values. It did not show you this text. So it's helpful to still jump to the detailed description of the field. If you click on the request priority, again, it will take you to the vocabulary for the priority, and you see these values right here. Okay, you have 4 values, and they are required. So you could only pick one out of these 4, but it's an optional field. You could choose to not populate it. Okay, so because these values are simple strings, they're just a string token. They could be that the value can be stored in a code, because a code is a very simple data type, and I'm about to click on it. So if I click on it, you are jumping to the page. It's a lengthy page that documents the data types. This is the page, the single long page that documents all data types, but I'm kind of jumped to the code section. Okay, so you'll see code right here, but notice that the code is not in its own section, and what I mean by that is if you scroll up, you'll see it's under the primitive types. Okay, so and if I scroll up a little bit more, you'll see there are all these diagrams up here. There are primitive types, which are, the usual stuff we're familiar with, integer, string, and so forth, Boolean, date, time. This is a primitive stuff. But in FHIR, there are complex data types, and that's kind of this area right here. So if you notice, code right here is a specialization of string, and string is just an element, which means it's a data element. It's not a resource, it's an element. So if you jump back to code, you'll see code is here. It describes what a code is. It basically is a string that has to satisfy this regular expression. So it's not its own data type, it's more of a regular expression rule over a string. Okay, so that's what I meant by code is not having its own data type section on this page. It's just further constraining of the data type, which is the string data type. And you could tell that from looking at the diagram above. You could tell that a code is a string, but I don't really see it here. It's saying it's a XML XSD schema token, and it's a JSON string. So this is where it helps you to understand if you're entering values in XML or in JSON. It's helping you give you a technical definition in those different representations what the value is. Okay, in FHIR it's called code. In JSON it's a string, and in XSD it's a token. Okay, so let me just, before I go back to the service request, again, this is a data type page, and you'll gradually be familiar with these data types. We looked at code. I'm going to look at codable concept and coding. These are complex data types that help you capture a code, but it helps you capture more than a code. Okay, so we'll look at that. And let's look at that going from the service request. I'm not sure if I'm going to find a coding in here. Yeah, there is no coding data type used in this resource, but there is a codable concept. So let's go to the codable concept data type that is used to capture the type of service request. So when you click on this, we're going to go back to the data type page in a different section. This is section 2.24. Okay, so what is a codable concept? Again, it's a data type, it's an element, it's not a resource, it's not a FHIR resource. So codable concept is a complex data type. So again, because it's complex, you have this kind of table to help you understand the structure of this data type. So codable concept, again, its type, its parent type is element. Codable concept has 2 fields in it. The difference between an element and a FHIR resource is that it has no identity. There is no identifier, business identifier. A codable concept cannot exist on its own. It exists in a resource. Okay, so a codable concept has 2 fields. It has a text field, which is a simple string, Okay, and if you click on it, it will take you to the detailed description of codable concept.txt, and it's a human language representation of the concept as seen, selected, uttered by the user who entered the data. So it's really the raw data that the user thought they are providing. Okay, it's not a coded value. Okay, it's just the raw data. Okay, so that's the text. And then you have a field that is a coding of that content that's in the text. And the coding field with a small c has a coding data type with a capital C. You could provide a coding, you could provide multiple codings, or you could provide nothing. And obviously creating a codable concept instance without providing either of these fields is meaningless. Even though the cardinality is 0, it's there to be flexible with how to use it, but you have to populate some of it. So you could use a codable concept and populate the string that the user provided without having any coding for it yet. But as you find out what the coding is, you could populate the coding. Okay, so now let's look at the definition of coding. So I'm going to click on the field name, not the field type, the field name. And you'll see a little description, you'll see comments, and you want to read all this. It's important. There's a lot of useful information sometimes hidden in comments and in various text. Okay, so that was the field. Now I'm going to click on the coding. And notice there is no vocabulary bindings on data types. Vocabulary bindings are on the values that can be put on fields, and the field has a data type. This is an example of a data type. Okay, so let's jump to coding. The coding data type. It's on the same page, but I think it's above the codable concept. So a coding is a rich structure that helps you capture a code and capturing the context for that code, the meaning. And all these values here are simple data types, and they're all optional, but obviously you have to use some of them. If you create a coding instance, you want to use one of them. So the system field helps you identify which terminology system your code is coming from. The version is to capture the version of the system that you're using. The code is the actual code defined by the system. So it's the number or the code. It's not the label. The display is the representation defined by the system, which you could think of as the display. And then whether or not this code was user selected. Okay, and if you click on user selected, let's see what additional description is there. So you could see here. So it's a safety criteria that you need to indicate if a physician picked the code, or was it a billing, or was it some kind of text processing that found this code, and so forth. So again, it helps to read this the first time to understand these fields. It's kind of important to do that. Okay, so let's go back. I wanted to click on this link here, but let's not do that yet. So the coding, in addition to having this table, you want to read the text, okay? And it's saying here this data type can be bound to a value set, and the binding is where you could say that a specific value set can be required, or an example, or it's extensible, so forth on the field. And there's a lot of content here to help you understand how to use a coding data type. And then the codable concept is even richer because it includes a coding, but it also includes the original text, if there was original text for it. And you could further read about a coding here, and there are examples. So this is a field. I know this looks strange, value codable concept, and I don't want to explain what that means right now. But this is basically an instance of a codable concept in JSON format. It has a coding field and it has a text field. The text field is just text. The coding has two codings of the same content. So one of them is coming from SNOMED. So this is the system URL and the code and the display. And this is another coding, okay, from a different system, but it's the same meaning. So you have two codings of the same meaning. Okay. And I'm just reading this. This is only capturing that it's negative, but the language actually is not just negative. It's negative for a specific test, which is not really captured here unless this Snowmode CT is negative for this test, which I don't think so, but let's not get into that now. Okay, so one step back, we're back at the codable concept. Another step back, we are back at the service request. You can see it right up here, service request. Okay. So that was the code field we looked at to say what type of service request it is. There's a category, and if you look at the category, again, this is an example vocabulary, and again, it's captured as codable concept. But to give you some sense of what category means, they give you at least an example to look at, and this is meant to make a distinction, a broad category distinction, if it's counseling, imaging, laboratory, so forth. It's not the specific lab test, it's just that it is a laboratory test versus some other kind of service. The code will capture the specific type within that category. Okay, so let's keep going down because there are a couple fields that are relevant to a project. The supporting info. Okay, the supporting info field, it's 0 to many, and it's a reference. It's a reference to any, which means it's a reference to any FHIR resource instance that you would like to point to say that you have supporting information that you want to hand over along with your service request. Okay, so when you see any, and I forgot, if you click on it, it looks like it's going to show you the full list of resources. It means you could pick any of these. You could pick any instance of these to point to as supporting information. Okay, and it's not, you could pick any and many of them. So you could point to various instances of type of resources. And it's a reference, and the reference is a data type, and if you click on it, you'll see it will take you back to the well, this is a page dedicated to what reference means. It is a data type, and the way you could tell is because the parent is element, although this reference is not in the data type page. It's in its own page, but it's still a specialized data type, and it has information here to help you point to another object, whether it's a FHIR resource instance on the same server, on some other server, or if you need to point to a data object in some other system and you don't have a direct URL, it gives you enough fields here and explanation to let you point to any other system and be clear about the target that you're pointing to in that system, if it's not a resource instance on the same server. Okay, so what I wanted to go into a little bit further here is the supporting information, supporting info. It says additional clinical information, but let's see if it says more when you go to the detailed description of the field. So you could see that this text is sort of unrelated to the simple sentence that you have here. It's not like it is the first sentence from the detail. So supporting info, this phrase here does not literally exist in the lengthy description here. Okay, so read this, and it basically shows you that you could provide information along with the service request. Okay, so clinical findings, for example, and clinical findings in FHIR are observations. And how long has it been? Let's see, we're half hour already. Maybe I'll leave the observation resource to another video, but basically that's kind of what a clinical finding is, and other observations says here. Okay. Okay, so you could kind of read, you could read in order to complete the order. So information that's necessary to complete the order. Okay, so that is the supporting info. You could point to a specimen, and a specimen field, you point, it's a reference, clearly to a specimen resource. It's not to anything. It's specifically to specimen. And you could point to 0 to many specimens. And you could also indicate a body site if that's useful and appropriate based on the category and the type of test and so forth. And so that is a walkthrough of, okay, so I did this table. Let me show you more stuff now. So we looked at the resource structure, its fields, its cardinality, the field type, and vocabulary links here, which are the value sets, and the binding of the value set to this specific field. Okay. And if you come back to the bottom of this table, you will see this link, documentation for this format. You'll see this on every table that is like this. And if you click on it, it helps you to kind of understand what these little symbols mean. Okay, so they give you an example up here, and then they tell you all these icons and what they mean. And then for the flags, which you see right here, if you keep coming down, it will tell you what these flags mean right here. Okay, so this is sort of a one-time thing. If you learn this, you'll understand it in all the other tables. It's used uniformly throughout the spec. Okay, so now if you come below the table, let me take a quick look. Okay, so if you come below the table, you'll see the definitions of this resource, which this table is created from. The definitions of this resource in XML format, or in a JSON format, and so forth. Okay, so I think if I click on this one, you will come to this page. This is a pretty version of it, but if you want to see the raw JSON, you click on this link right here, and you'll get the raw JSON. And this is, if you open this, you'll see this is where the resource itself is defined. This is not an instance of the resource, it's the definition of the resource, and I don't want to get into that right now. Okay. Now, above here, you have sort of the same representation of that table that you saw, but it is represented in a JSON format. Okay. Okay. So now we looked at the definition of the resource. There's a narrative description. There is the detailed description of the fields on this tab, which you go to by clicking on the field name. The examples tab is examples of instances of service requests. So let's just look at one. Let's look at a lipid panel order. You could look at an example in XML or JSON. Okay, so let's look at a JSON example. And let's go to the raw form, and just let me open the page source so we could see the actual JSON. So this is basically saying resource type. It's an instance of the service request resource. The ID is just an ID for this instance. There's text, and let's skip to the code. Okay, the code is a lipid code coming from this system. Okay, and the text that was seen or entered by the user was lipid panel. And let's see if there's a category up here saying that's a lab test, and I don't see that, or I'm missing that. Okay, so that is the code. There is supporting info, and it's an array. Okay, and it has a reference to a fasting status, and I'm guessing this is going to be a, you know what, I'm not sure what this instance is of, because supporting info is a pointer to any resource instance. And at the top of my head, I can't figure out what this is. Okay, anyway. It's a reference to some kind of fasting resource, and this is a reference to some specimen identified by this URL fragment. And it's a serum specimen. These examples are not necessarily fully complete. They're just there to give a example. Okay, so you have many more examples to look through. And let's skip looking at profiles and extensions. But before you go on and extend a resource, you want to see if there is already an extension defined that you could use along with the resource. And I'm not going to get into discussing extensions in this video because I think it's enough so far. Okay, so this is just navigating a documentation for a specific resource service request. If you think this is useful, let me know. I will create another video. I think the other very confusing thing with FHIR is the idea of what is a profile versus what people commonly think of as you're creating a subtype, and people think that they could add fields in their profile. But really, a profile, the way most people use FHIR is a constraint on existing fields. You don't define additional new fields. The way to add additional fields is by using this extension field. So these are, again, these are fields that are inherited from the parent. So if you go to the domain resource, you will see there is an extension field on it. And how to use this is confusing in the beginning, and I'll have a different video for that, if that helps. Okay, that's it for this one. See you next time.